inconvenient. So as a fiction writer, I want to tell you a story. And this is a story you won't hear in the news. And this is an American story. And I know that India has a different story happening right now. But I want to tell you how, when I was a child, my father had a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was color-coded to show what property values would be worth when the ocean levels rose. So he would terrorize all of my friends anytime they came over, and he would talk about what would happen when the oceans start warming and carbon plumes into the sky and the whole earth starts to smell like rotten eggs. So my friends stopped wanting to come over. When my brother got married and had a baby, the first thing he announced to our family, the first thing that my dad said was, well, you won't need to worry about paying for college, because there's not going to be any college in the future. So I grew up with these stories about climate change. I grew up watching these graphs where it showed the carbon temperature or the carbon in the air with the earth temperature and how they were correlated. Anytime the carbon went up, the temperature went up. Until finally, in the final graph, the carbon went way up to the sky, and it just left it to your imagination of what would happen to the planet. So the thing is that in my child's mind, it was the reality that we have right now, and then it was all of a sudden the reality in the future where the air smelled like rotten eggs. I didn't imagine that long 100 years of transition, that long 100 years of droughts and fires and floods. So in California, we've been seeing this slowly. We've been watching 130 million trees slowly die because of a beetle that has affected the trees, because the trees are vulnerable now because of the drought. So the drought is drying the trees, and the trees are sucking up all the water out of desperation and then rotting and falling on people's houses. So a tree fell on my brother's house. But what I've noticed is that slowly this has been happening. California has slowly been getting hotter. In San Francisco, there was a 106-degree day in September, which is 42 degrees. And this is a city that Mark Twain said the coldest winter he ever experienced was a summer in San Francisco. So San Francisco is a very cold city. So we had this hot day that broke all records. Where I live, we grow grapes and apples. And in one day, all of the apples fell from the trees. We lost our whole apple crop. No one would pick the grapes because it was too hot. So we're the famous wine growing region. We lost all of our wine crops. So still, no one was talking about climate change. There was no mention of it in the newspaper at all. It was like we were the slow boiling frog in the water that was slowly heating up. So I started attending a climate change group because I wondered, why are people not talking about it? And so this group had read a book, and it was called Why Our Brains Are Hardwired to Ignore Climate Change. It was by a guy named George Marshall. And he said many things. But he said that facts just don't change people's minds. And we see that in the US now, is that we've become almost a tribal culture. There's people who believe in climate change and there's people who don't. So he said the only thing that changes people's minds are stories. That stories that appeal to the heart are the only thing that changes people's minds. So I thought a lot about that, about what kind of a story could change people's minds. And so there's a genre called climate fiction or ecological literature. And a lot of it is like my child's mind that imagined a now and then a sort of drought-ravaged, flood-ridden, dystopic future. And the problem with those kinds of narratives is that then people start imagining horror scenarios, so they don't want to think about climate change. They associate negative feelings around it, and it also perpetuates the fiction that climate change might simply be a fiction. So they ask scientists about these novels, about, these novels about people trading water for drugs and people having to live in these, dystopic futures where hummingbirds go through evolution and they become albino, and people are having to pollinate the flowers because all of the bees are gone. And so they paint these pictures of these horrible futures, which probably are pictures that we are heading toward, but they're actually not using the imagination in the way the imagination could be used. They're more extension rather than imagination. So there's also a lot of evidence that whether you believe in climate change doesn't make a whole lot of difference about whether you do anything about it. So there's this word, it's a Greek word called akrasia. And religious leaders are really familiar with this word because it means knowing the right thing to do, but the persistent unwillingness to actually do anything about it. So I think the problem is that we're stuck in that kind of a lull of knowing that we're heading toward suicide, planetary suicide, and yet not knowing what to do about it. So I was watching the panel discussion on climate change at the Jaipur Literary Festival. I was watching on YouTube. There was a talk about climate change. And there was a woman there named Mridula Ramesh, I think, who wrote a book about what India can do about climate change. And she said that she had been hearing about climate change for many, many years and had done nothing until she lost the water in her well. So her family lost all of their water, and suddenly it became really real. So I wanted to show you this video of when climate change became really real for me, but it's too complicated. So I'll tell you about it, and I'll read to you about it. So in 2007, as I said, we had this hottest year in history in California. And we woke up in the morning of October 8th, and we thought we had just been attacked by North Korea. The entire 360 square miles of fire had erupted over the night. Half of my town burned down. California had seen nothing like this. So I'm going to read a little section of what I wrote. Thank you. This is in a magazine called N+1, so I'm just going to read a short section from it. On the evening of the 8th of October, in the 17th year of the century, severe gusts of dry winds blew across desiccated grasses and diseased trees caused by years of excessive heat and drought. A great flood that year had fattened grasses into combustible fuel. The wind knocked down power lines that lit the trees on fire. In one night, a storm of fire destroyed 1,000 homes in a single neighborhood. Neighbors pounded on neighbors' doors, honking horns, trying to rescue each other. Most report that drivers were calm, though a few trying to escape drove down the sidewalk. One woman managed to stuff her pony inside her car. Another woman had to choose between saving her car or her horse. She jumped on her horse in her pajamas and rode away in the flames. The fires burned for over a week, killed 44 people, and destroyed over 10,000 homes. It was the most destructive fire in US history, until this last year, when the fire was 4 times as big. During the days of the fires, I took walks, trying to read people's lives through all of the paper falling from the sky, curled like chocolate shavings. They were all the same size, the size of my palm. I wanted to make sense of things. I wanted to make a collection of all the scattered notes, but they would only disintegrate if I picked them up, staining my fingers with the smell of poison. I was looking for stories, but I could only find information. Bible pages, cell phone bills, pieces of romance novels, gold embossed stationery with someone's name written over and over in tiny letters, Swedish vacation package tours, a kid's homework, he did poorly, journal pages, so many pages of people talking to themselves. I walked and tried not to breathe the air. Everyone spoke of particulate matter. In the hardware stores, all you needed to say is, "Where are they?" And they'd point to the pile of masks. Warily, I looked at all that shoulder-high grass, all that explosive fuel. The color of pale grasshoppers was the only thing that stood between an out-of-control fire and me. No one knew where the fire was anymore. The news broadcasters weren't allowed to get close. We only knew that it was 100% uncontained and that all effort was focused on rescuing people. I walked into the grasses to get away from the panic in people's expressions. During earthquakes, chimneys crumble. After fires, only brick chimneys are left standing. Even metal melts. A few partially melted cars drove by. During the fires, my psyche felt singed. There was no digesting this fire. There was no beginning, middle, and end. My old high school had burned, my cousins were evacuated, the house of my university's president burned, and the houses of at least a dozen friends. The climax had already happened, but unlike a novel, it kept continuing another 6 days. Scorching those places I held inside me for direction, for guidance. I hadn't walked on Sugarloaf Park in years, but I visited there in my mind every time I used the word Poison Oak or Gallup, since it was on that ridge that I learned those words. I heard a Native American storyteller once say that the earth was his sacred text that he read for wisdom. But now that the earth's pages were burnt, could the earth still be read? I kept looking for paper. Before the fires, I'd been teaching a class on ecology. We were learning about systems theory and the interdependency of ecosystems, how trees communicate and send messages and medicines to other parts of the forest, how trees draw up water to share with other plants. We read a book about how to enter the imaginative kingdom of plants, how to enter their dreamscapes. We read stories of how bees know the location of every flower in a 60-mile vicinity. We learned how butterflies make their own tinctures of nectar-soaked pollen, and how elephants concoct their own forest alcohol and get drunk. Or even more remarkable, how chimpanzees will fold up a leaf like an accordion and swallow it so that it scrapes away the intestinal worms in his digestive tract. The fact that insects can digest the compounds in eucalyptus and create excrement that inhibits the growth of encroaching plants, like mustard, is certainly astonishing. This is probably why the eucalyptus has been so successful as an invasive species in California. But why in the 1850s, when a Manic government campaign set about planting eucalyptus throughout California for its fast-growing wood needs for railroad ties and fence posts, did the eucalyptus, unlike the old-growth eucalyptus in Australia, twist when it dried and become so hard it was unusable? The weekend before the fires, I had attended a grief workshop sponsored by the climate change group I was a part of. They told us that grief processed alone turns to despair, but grief processed communally becomes medicine. They told us that now that we knew the reality of climate change, we would grieve the earth. That way the grief wouldn't hold us back when it was time to mobilize. To prepare us, they drew 2 circles on the chalkboard. Inside one circle was written, "Your comfort zone." Inside the second, quite a bit far from the first, was written, "Where the magic happens." I was going to have to get way out of my comfort zone to get to the magic, which I was not looking forward to. The day before the workshop, I had gone to the ocean to prepare, to think about what I had to grieve, but I realized I wasn't yet ready to grieve the earth. As long as there is hope, there's no space for grief. But I grieved when I looked at the sea and saw the tangled seaweed on top, all I could think of was the word holdfast, the name for the dangly part of the seaweed that clings to rock. Our climate change group had encouraged us to remember the word holdfast in order to steady ourselves when things got rough. Instead of reciting sea and black rock and cliff poems in my head as I used to while walking along this beach, I thought of pH balances and dying plankton, and the article I just read that the last time the oceans were this acidic, 97% of ocean life went extinct. At the grief workshop, we shared more anger than sadness. People were angry at the flagrant, unapologetic, and frivolous violence to scientific consensus. The facilitator, Frances Weller, a therapist who had lived with indigenous cultures throughout the world, said that since we are continuously bombarded by bad news, we live in a state of chronic secondary trauma. It starts even before when we're born with our cave child DNA, still expecting to see 40 pairs of eyes looking towards us, asking what we dreamed that night, if we would help collect the firewood, if we'd be at the ceremony tonight with the elders. Our psyches, at least our American psyches, were never prepared to deal with the modern isolation of American culture, nor the sadness of the tragedies we see every day, nor the reality of our dying ecosystems. By numbing out, we have become immune to beauty. He said that when we process grief in community, then we restore our capacity to be astonished. For hundreds of thousands of years, grief rituals would recalibrate the fields of trauma. In other words, we used to have a healthy grief processing ecosystem. But these days, in the US, there's no communal cup of sorrow. There is only psychotherapy, which colludes with the increasing trends of privatization of our culture, the privatization of property, the privatization of consciousness, and the privatization of grief, as in own your sorrow, which is actually a terrible idea. The word grief comes from gravity, as in heavy, as in fall on your knees. The word gravitas means someone who has turned her face into the winds of sorrow and turned that grief into medicine, a kind of alchemy that our culture is deeply in need of. These days, the great fear we have about grief is that we have to face it alone, and in avoiding it, it settles like sediment in our psyches. Our grief workshop leader suggested that perhaps the only thing that will save us is our own broken hearts, for true action can only come through these deeper feelings. So, on the fourth night of the fires, the humidity plummeted again, and everyone's anxiety peaked. A dry wind was expected to blow almost as strongly as the night the fire started, potentially sparking new fires. I packed a suitcase full of clothes and looked around my room. Do I pack all of our family's photos? How is it possible to choose between items of sentimental value? Better to just leave it all. A friend called and said, I don't get along with my neighbors. I don't completely trust them. If the fire gets close, will you call me? At least we have the public pool across the street, my mom said. There was that couple that had taken refuge in their neighbor's pool while their house burned. They stayed in the water for 6 hours, covering their faces with wet shirts whenever they had to come up to breathe. How long does it take for a house to burn? The woman had wondered underwater. My sister-in-law called and said, remember how when your brother and I first got married and your dad was always talking about global warming? Turns out he was right. My dad called. Lately, I've been needing Ambien to sleep. I'll forego that tonight. We made a plan. It seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. If the wind blew the fire this way, we'd get in our cars and head to the ocean. If the fire kept following us, we would drive into the ocean. The next day, having survived the night, I drove to the ocean. I was searching for clean air, but smoke covered the soot-colored sky all the way to the horizon. Driving back home, I started to speed. During fires, the rule of law no longer applies. Law enforcement has other things to do than care about speeders. This is the wildness that descends during fires. This is the triggered reptilian brain. At this point, the crisis mind can offer no solutions. During the fires, we craved sugar and fat. We ordered takeout pizza and didn't mention to each other that we usually never eat pizza anymore. During the fires, my neighbor even forgot she didn't eat wheat. During fires, all I could think of was the word hold fast. During the fires is the only time we watched the news about the current presidential administration for comic relief. During the fires, a friend who was evacuated said he grabbed his 2 dogs and 2 banjos and hustled into his car. Driving away, he realized that was all he cared about. He had forgotten to pack any clothes. During fires, you hear over and over, I lost everything, but at least I have my life. A couple of people, after losing everything, knocked on the door of a man whose house was for sale. They said, we've lost everything. Can we buy your house and everything in it? He left everything he owned to them, including his toaster and bath towels. During fires, only those who became volunteers maintained a semblance of psychological health. Turned away by the Red Cross disaster relief, they galvanized together and formed more effective citizen coalitions. They supplied the families camping at the beaches with sleeping bags. During the fires, someone kept taping up signs that read, the love in the air is thicker than the smoke. During the fires, for the first time in a long time, no one in my town went hungry. The Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh writes in his book, The Great Derangement, that in the old times, as in the last century, everyone who lived in the Sundarbans had a family member who'd been killed by a tiger. Those who had escaped would describe the weird, uncanny look of mutual recognition when they made eye contact with the gaze of the tiger, an expression of wildness and intimate communication with the non-human. Ghosh says that now, in the anthropogenic age, we will confront that wildness again, this time in the eye of the hurricane and the tongue of the flame. Stories will become more alien, less human, more strange. The stranger the stories, the more we will recognize them and be recognized in them. They will speak in his words of the interconnectedness of the transformations that are now underway. Ghosh suggests that we need to reimagine modern narrative. He correlates the carbon economy, which is individual consumption, with the modern novel, which is the individual moral adventure. He says if we're going to survive this age, it can't be about moral decisions any longer, about individual moral decisions. It has to be about a collective story, not just the collective story of other humans, but those we share a planet with. So how does this get depicted in fiction? Fiction is one type of story. So in the West, we're trained by this Western narrative this Aristotelian story structure where you have this hero and he has some sort of goal, and how his character is revealed shows how he achieves that goal. So it's all about a particular point of view. But fiction is also about tracking states of consciousness. So in the West, we've become addicted to tracking the state of a sort of individualistic consciousness. But I think that it's time to move away from that particular narrative, because that particular narrative is not conducive to understanding what's going on with the climate right now. So the Native Americans in the US have a prophecy that there will come a time when the white man will seek answers from the red man. And they believe that that time is now. They actually say that this is the best time to be Native American in history because they feel assured that their way is actually the right way. It's the only way to create a sustainable Earth. They know that it's actually the story that has to change. So in California, after the fires, all of a sudden, the word climate change appeared in the news everywhere. We had a month-long climate conference, a month-long summit. And for the first time, there was the typical corporations trying to get a good reputation by appearing very green. And then there were these Native Americans coming onto the stage. And every time they spoke, the audience was stilled into silence. Because they weren't trying to say, you should do this, you should do this. They were reminding us of a different type of consciousness. So there was a man from a sea lion tribe in Alaska. And he stood up before us and he just introduced himself. He said, "Hello, my other self. This afternoon tastes delicious." And everyone in the audience was silent because they knew that there was some sort of truth to his word, something that they had forgotten. Hillary Clinton says that in order to raise a child, we have to think like a village. But unfortunately, Americans have lost that ability to think like a village. It requires a long apprenticeship. We have these deep habits from living in an isolated self. The environmentalist Paul Shepard, in his book Coming Home to the Pleistocene, states that the way that our brains evolved was in wonder, was in looking at nature and being in awe, that we looked at a sunset and saw its beauty, and in that beauty is when we actually became wise and smarter and more human. And he says that that is who we all are, that we have 2 million years of co-evolving with plants and animals. And it's only been in the last 10,000 that we have agriculture. So it's the 2 million-year-old memory that we have of this intimate collaboration with plants. The native Pomos in my region, we have a disease for the oak trees. It's called the sudden oak death syndrome. And it's affected millions of trees. And the Native Americans believe that it's actually a disease of sadness. because the trees are no longer in collaboration with humans. The humans used to have salmon ceremonies around the trees, and you can actually find salmon in their DNA. So after the fires, all of these people, it's true, were seeking advice from these Native Americans. They were saying, what is it that we have to do? They said, in order to create a sustainable earth, you have to navigate the journey between the head and the heart. So all of these white people in the audience said, well, how do we do that? We don't know how to do that. And so they gave a lot of answers. They said, well, you could cry every day for a month. Maybe that will derange your mind, because the American mind needs a little bit of rearranging. Someone said, I don't know how to tell you how to do it. We've always known our connection to the Mother Earth. When we're born, our mothers plant our umbilical cord into the earth. So we know that our mother, the earth is our mother. We don't know any other way. A Native woman from Canada said, we have a sacred connection and we will defend her. Another said, don't take our ceremonies, ask your own ancestors. They will bring you back. So Janet Armstrong of the Okanagan First Nation tribe in Canada says that it's imperative that we all become Indigenous. Otherwise, we don't know what we have done. But the key is not impersonating or imitating, but to become attuned to our own deeper natures. Practices and traditions aren't transferable, but values can be. Values of sustainability, interconnectedness, and restoration. And you don't have to be an Indigenous person to recognize the importance of these values. So there was a radio announcer named Tom Hartman, and he wrote a letter to the Indigenous people of California trying to explain why so many Americans were showing up, trying to seek guidance. And he said, we are the dominant people of this country, but we have lost everything. Our problem is that we have lost our roots. Back in England, we used to live on the land, we used to have commons, but with industrialization, we were kicked off of our land, and we haven't healed from those wounds. So some say that all of our school shootings and our drug problems are the results of not having healed from these wounds of losing our connection to the land. Many Indigenous cultures have no word for wild because it was the world they lived in. Current psychology says that whatever is denied you, you will have a hard time giving to others. So we lost our wildness and then became angry at wildness. John Stokes, another Native American elder, said, what you don't talk to, you don't understand. What you don't understand, you fear, and what you fear, you try to destroy. Douglas Cardinal, another First Nation architect from the Metis tribe, writes about his own healing process. He says, I had to be taken to Medicine Man Chief Small Boys Camp at a time when I was very ill. At that camp, a lot of time was spent helping me become balanced internally. They healed me with their ceremonies. I was told that the world I'd created in my mind was destroying me. I wasn't in harmony with who I was. In the ceremonies, to seek harmony within myself, I had to deal with the things inside that were destructive to me. He goes on to say, a sensitivity, a relationship exists between all beings and all things. Cultures are not being bridged into a balanced way, and as a result, each culture has become a victim of the other. He says cultures must enhance each other, and each one has 100% responsibility to bridge. He says creativity is our responsibility, our purpose. One empowers oneself to do the impossible. The more impossible, the more creative. The world around us opposes that in a powerful way. The world opposes all change. One must expect opposition. To move from the known, you must know that the moment you make a decision in that direction, you totally oppose all and face total disagreement. It is in that moment that you jump out in the creative sense. To do otherwise is not new. It is not creative, but simply shifting of pieces. So we can't go back, but we don't need to go back because we never left. According to the poet Gary Snyder, the real work is becoming native to our own land, developing a loyalty to the land. It means restoring the land with stories by that ancient storyteller that is still wired to pick up certain cadences, to have encounters with the spiritual world, that internal storyteller who was evolutionarily sculpted by the howl of the wolf and the wind. Paul Shepard goes on to say that there's an original human, the secret person, undamaged in every person. Right now, it could be called the ecological unconsciousness. Perhaps the new novel doesn't have words. Perhaps it's a ritual instead. The Native American Pueblo writer Leslie Marmon Silko wrote a novel called Ceremony, where the act of reading is an act of ceremonial healing. So at the climate change conference, people asked, well, how can we create rituals if we have lost ours? And the Native Americans said, attune yourself to the earth's dreams. The earth dreams in ritual. So what is that ritual? How can I have that dream? At first I thought that this earth dreaming must be something mysterious. So the next time I was at my aunt's house, I asked her, if the earth dreams in ritual, how can we tap into those earth dreams? And so she sat and thought about it and said, nature is a mnemonic device. It's a memory device. She said, those redwood trees just standing there are a constant reminder of our ancestors. Then she added, regular humans take up too much psychic space. But those purple flowers growing up with those yellow flowers, do you know they just planted themselves there all by themselves, just hopped over the neighbor's fence? And so if I were thinking of what sorts of ritual the earth is doing, I would say she just keeps making images of herself with endless imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for the thought-provoking and impressive lecture that you have given.